Okay, so in this video, we're basically going to look at the totals and filters options. So you'll notice that the first option here deals with grand totals, right? So you can say it says grand totals for rows and grand totals for columns. So this is the grand total here for each of the rows. This column here shows you the grand total for each row. And right at the bottom over here, let me just actually collapse all of these. So remember, to collapse everything, we could go here and say collapse field. And now you can see this grand total here is for all of the columns, right? So you've got this one and you've got that one. And remember, you can also turn these off under the design tab. So if you go under the design tab, you could say off for rows and columns like that, or you could actually turn it on. So it's the same option that we're seeing here under the pivot table totals and filters. We can turn on, show the grand totals for the rows and show the grand totals for the columns. So remember, we can do it via the pivot table options or under the design tab under the grand totals option over here. Then coming to the next option, which is allowing multiple filters per field, right? So when you actually click on any of these drop downs, remember, if I click on this drop down, you basically have these filters, and you also have value filters and label filters, which we covered in an earlier video. So what I want to point out is that normally if you've got a value filter, you may not be able to have a label filter, and vice versa. It's either one or the other, unless this particular option is set on. So this option over here, just going back to the options, this option here needs to be ticked on, allow multiple filters. If you have this ticked on, you'll then be able to set both a label filter as well as a value filter on a particular field. Finally, under the sorting option, we've got the use custom lists when sorting. So remember, we had different custom lists if you don't want to sort using the normal alphabetical order. And if you want that to be available, you need to make sure that that's ticked on for this particular pivot table. We now move on to the display tab. And now the display tab says, show these expand and collapse buttons. So it's these buttons over here, the pluses and minuses. So let's say I tick it off, right? And I say, okay, you can see those have disappeared. I don't see those expand and collapse buttons. I also want to point out that under the pivot table analyze tab, you can also turn it off and on over here. So it's effectively the same thing. You can see I've now turned it on and I can basically expand. And I can also click here to turn it off, and now it's actually no longer available. So the same option that is that's here under this particular tab is what's being referred to under the pivot table options under the display option of show and expand collapse buttons. Then you've got this option here to show contextual tooltips. So I'm going to tick it on to show you what that does. So if I click on OK, when I hover over any amount, you can see it tells me the value, and then it says what row it is and what column it is. So it just gives you more detail in terms of what's making up that particular amount. So if I have that turned off, going into the pivot table options, and if we turn off the show contextual tooltips, now when I hover over any of these things, it won't give me that particular data. Okay, we now actually move to the display field captions and filter dropdown. So you can see these are the field captions and the dropdowns. Watch what happens when I tick it off. So if I tick it off over there and I say okay, you can see it's actually disappeared. So to basically add it back on, if we go back to the pivot table options and the display, we can actually click that, and if I say okay now, okay, we now come to this option of the classic pivot table layout. This is the old pivot table layout that was in much earlier versions of Excel. So we're not basically going to be using that in this particular course. So we won't really look at that option. Then we've got this option called show the values row. Now this is only applicable when you have more than one item under the values option over here, right? So let me just show you what that does. Let's actually take out this years just to make it easier to view. And let's add in the cost of sales and the gross profit. So now we've got multiple values over here. In the columns, right? You can see there's multiple values. Now if we go into the pivot table options and under the display we say show the values row, it's simply this particular row over here, the word values. So you can hide that if you want by going into this option over here and going into the display and actually saying, ticking off the show values row. That will hide that, and you'll see that once I click on OK. I'll say OK, and you can see that's gone. Now going back into the options over here, which deals with the field list, it says, do you want to sort the field list in data source order or A to Z? Now the field list is this list of fields that it actually pulls from the initial data table, right? So exactly the order that we had it in, let's just actually put it into A to Z. So watch how this actually changes. And if I say okay, you can see this has now become alphabetical with C on the top and then D and so forth. The initial sort of default order will be exactly as we had it in the data sheet. So date is first, customer, region, so forth. So this would be the default order as it's pulled it through. But if you wanted to use an alphabetical order instead, you could do that. I'm going to turn it back onto the default order by going into the options again, going into the display and saying, let's use it in the data source order. And I say, okay, and you can see now it's in the data source order over here.